Christian Church. It is great to be here. It's been great to hang out with Eric and Laura, and great to see some familiar faces that I got to meet yesterday, some new faces, and a few faces that I've known for quite a while. So good to see be here in Twin Falls, and it's been a great weekend here. And on behalf of Boise Bible College, I just want to say thank you so much for your partnership with us. And we are excited to be sending students here. We're excited to have you guys come visit us for some of the events that we have. Right through those doors on your right as you came in, you can find a little display table. There's more information. You are welcome to grab any of that information. And I've got 2 extra large t-shirts. That's the only size I have, but I have 2 extra large t-shirts, and I would love to leave them here. So if you want a t-shirt, let me know if that's your size, and I'll be happy to give you a t-shirt. We like to have fun at Boise Bible College, and pretty soon school will be starting up. Can you believe that today is the first day of August? I saw that on my phone this morning when I woke up, and it was not a welcome sight. That means that the days are counting down before I report back to work and everything kicks off again, and we're getting ready for classes. I like to have fun with classes, and I'm a bit of a football fan. My team is the Kansas City Chiefs. And we had some good conversations earlier about the Chiefs. I can name like Chiefs quarterbacks from the early 80s, really, all the way back to Dave Craig and some old school guys, right? Before Joe Montana came to the Chiefs. So I remember those. But for fun, in my classes, when my students are fans of other teams, I don't gamble, but I'll buy you something that I would buy you anyway, and just to make it fun, we'll let the game decide who gets to buy the coffee. So that's what I do. So I'll tell my students, if you want to put a coffee on the game, we'll do that. So I had one student who was a big Patriots fan, and it was Chiefs against Patriots, and the Chiefs won. It was a good day for me. So she had to bring coffee to class, but I was going to bring donuts to class anyway that day. So I picked up the donuts for all the students. I get to class, and she's got a coffee for me, and then I had one special donut just for that student. And because in the game, the Chiefs had 3 interceptions and a fumble recovery, so I said, I got you a turnover. And it was I pay money for my puns. So we had fun with that. But not only is school starting up, but football starting up, and that was my favorite football story from teaching. But I'm going to share with you one of my favorite football stories from high school football. And this is a true story. It happened about 15 years ago. I read about it in Sports Illustrated and just love this story. It's a story about a high school football game that took place in Texas. And there was the hometown Grapevine team, and the visiting team was from Gainesville. So you got to keep them straight. There's 2 G teams. Hometown Grapevine, visitors from Gainesville. And what was weird about this game is that the hometown Grapevine locals, they made a 40-yard spirit line with a tornado banner at the end of it, which is weird because the Grapevine team was the Lions, and it was the visiting team that was the Tornadoes. And they had the visiting team players run through a little banner at the end of their spirit line. And at during the game, there were more than 200 local Grapevine fans that sat on the visiting team's side and cheered for the visiting team players by name. And you had Grapevine mothers like cheering for opposing team players to tackle their own sons. And when the game was over and the clock went down to 0, the hometown Grapevine Lions had scored 33 points, and the visiting Gainesville Tornadoes had scored 14. They lost, and that loss meant that the Tornadoes' record on that year was 0-9. And yet, you couldn't tell by the way that the players were giving each other squirt bottle showers and celebrating at the end of the game. And the quarterback for the Gainesville Tornadoes, his name was Isaiah, and he quoted I never thought in my life that I would hear people cheering for us to hit their kids. But they really wanted us to. Which makes you ask the question, what kind of parent would cheer against their own kids and cheer for the opposing team? What kind of parent would do something like that? And to understand that question, we're going to have to put my favorite football story on hold for just a moment, and I'm going to look at another favorite story. This is what I think is God's favorite story. Now, I don't have an inside track. God never told me that this is his favorite story. I just have a strong hunch. And you can decide for yourself at the end if you agree that this might be God's favorite Old Testament story as well. It's a story that appears in Genesis chapter 22 of your Bibles. So if you want to open up your Bibles to Genesis chapter 22, we're going to look at the story of Abraham and Isaac. But before we get to this point in Abraham's life, we need to kind of work our way up to it. And I know that Eric's been preaching through Genesis, and you've been hearing some of these stories. So when we first met Abraham in the book of Genesis, he was already 75 years old, and at that point, his name was still Abram. And that's 10 chapters earlier where we first meet Abram in Genesis chapter 12. And back in chapter 12, that's where God promised Abram that I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples will be blessed because of you. That's a great promise where God is saying bless, 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 bless over and over again. To repeat it, Abraham, do you know that God is promising to bless you? That's the message. And what we see in between Genesis chapter 12 and our chapter today, Genesis 22, is test after test after test for that promise. God's promise to bless Abraham is tested over and over again. Actually, in chapter 12, as soon as Abraham arrives in the land, he leaves his hometown back in Ur of the Chaldeans, goes to the promised land, and there's a famine. No food. Abraham can't stay in the promised land if there's nothing to eat, so Abraham leaves the promised land as soon as he gets there and goes down to Egypt where there is food. How can God keep his promise to Abraham if Abraham isn't the land that God told him that he would keep his promises in? But God is faithful, and he keeps his promise. But while Abraham is down in Egypt, there's the Pharaoh of Egypt, and he sees his wife, Sarai, notices that she's beautiful, and Abraham tells a half-truth and says, oh, not my wife, this is my sister, and she ends up in the harem of Pharaoh as a wife. And how can Abraham become the father of many nations if his wife is with another man? But God is faithful, and he keeps his promise. A couple chapters later in Genesis 14, Abraham has a nephew. His name is Lot. He gets kidnapped by this king, Kedorlaomer. And that king was having a battle with some other kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham, he goes to war against those kings to rescue his nephew Lot. And there's a tension in the story there. How can God keep his promise to Abraham if Abraham gets killed in battle? But God's faithful, and he keeps his promise. Then you go to the next chapter, chapter 15. Abraham decides that he needs an heir, a legal heir. He needs someone to pass his inheritance on to, and he doesn't have a son yet, so he's going to appoint his number one top servant, Eleazar, as the heir. How can Abraham have descendants like sand on the seashore and stars in the sky if his servant is his heir? But God is faithful and keeps his promise. And then in chapter 16, Abraham finally has a son. And the son was from the wrong mother, though. And not from his wife Sarai, but from his wife's servant Hagar. And the son was Ishmael. That was not the wife or the child of the promise. Abraham, is it going to work if you try to get God's promise to work on your own terms and not the terms that God had said? But God is faithful and he keeps the promise. And then finally we get to Genesis chapter 20. And then there's this king, a different king, Abimelech, but the same story round two. He sees Abraham's wife and decides that he would like her for his own wife. And Abraham does the exact same thing that he did earlier and says, oh, she's really just my sister, and lies about that, doesn't tell the full truth. And now again, Abraham's wife is with another man, and now the promise is threatened one more time. It's as if Abraham didn't learn anything the first time. So not only is he making a mistake, he's making a dumb mistake a second time. And God is faithful, and he keeps his promise. Have you noticed a pattern? That all throughout these 10 chapters, as we introduce this story to Abraham, time after time, a situation comes up and it threatens to cancel that blessing that God has promised. Sometimes the threat comes from the outside, like a famine. Sometimes the threat comes from the inside, like Abraham's own stupidity. But every single time, God is faithful and saves the promise of his blessing. Have you experienced that kind of faithfulness from God in your own life? Whether the threats of his faithfulness come from the outside or the threats of his faithfulness come from the inside, have you experienced God continuing to be faithful to his promise to watch over you no matter what happens? God is faithful to his promises. And so we finally get to Genesis chapter 21. And in 21, that's where Abraham, at the age of 100, and Sarah, at the age of 90, finally become proud parents of the promised heir, baby Isaac. And it seems like this is the point in the story to finally say, and they lived happily ever after. Like it's time for Abraham and Sarah and Isaac to, move to the suburbs in a nice little cul-de-sac and get a house with a nice picket fence and enroll Isaac into the best schools and just sit back and relax in the blessing of God. That's what I think chapter 22 should be about. And yet, this is how chapter 22 begins. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham? Here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. That's not how the chapter is supposed to go. That's not how the story is supposed to go. Not the way that I want the story to go. And it causes us to ask another question. What kind of God would ask this kind of sacrifice of a person? Up to this point, Abraham had seen God prove faithful and preserve the promised blessing against every threat, both externally and internally. But now, this last threat is not from a king and not from a famine and not from Abraham's own stupidity. This threat is from God himself. And there's no question about what God is asking Abraham to do. Did you see how explicit he makes it? Your son, only son, Isaac, whom you love. And all throughout the entire rest of this story in the chapter, it's expanded and it keeps saying Isaac, his son Isaac, my son. And those phrases are repeated over and over and over again in this chapter. And each time you can feel the wound in Abraham's heart just dig deeper and deeper and deeper. You know what amazes me most in this story is the beginning of verse 3. It says, early the next morning. That's why this is Abraham's story and not the story of Vance. Because between verse 2 and verse 3, if this were the story of Vance, there would be a whole lot of questioning going on. Why, God? Why would you ask this? Are you sure? What about your promise, God? What would have been between verse 2 and verse 3 if this were your story? What would you have asked? What would you have questioned? How would you have felt? How would you have processed? How would you have tried to rationalize some other way to handle the situation aside from doing exactly what God had asked you to do? But verse 3 says that Abraham got up early the next morning and he obeyed. And for 3 days, Abraham and Isaac walked. And for 3 days, Abraham has to think in the back of his mind about what's going to happen when he gets there. This is not the first time that God had challenged Abraham. Earlier, at the beginning of the story, God spoke Abraham's name and called Abraham and said, leave your family behind, your family in Ur, leave them behind and go to the promised land. That was a challenge that cut Abraham off from his past. But now this is a challenge that will cut Abraham off from his future. And not only was Abraham's son's life on the line, but so are God's promises, and so is the blessing. And so we ask this question again: what kind of God would ask someone to make this kind of sacrifice? And I think we have an answer to the question. The answer to the question is the kind of God who would want to know what you love most. God's blessings, or the God who gives the blessing. What do we love most? Do we love the blessings that we get to enjoy, or do we love the God from whom the blessings come? God had made a promise to Abraham to bless him beyond his wildest dreams, but this test will determine which one does Abraham love more, the blessing that was promised or the God who promised the blessing. And often what happens in life, in my life and in your life, is that some of God's greatest blessings often become some of the greatest temptations in our life. Some of the greatest tests as we are tempted to love that blessing more than the God who gave it. What do you love most in life? About what would you say, oh God, please don't ask that? It could be our children. It could be your spouse. It could be a financial blessing, or maybe it's a job, or maybe it's a special gift or ability that makes you who you are. And these blessings become tests to find out, what do I really love most? The blessing or the God who gives the blessing? It was the same test that was faced by the rich young ruler. In Luke 18, the rich young ruler approaches Jesus and asks the question, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life? And he says, I've already kept all the laws. He wanted to add to his resume. I mean, he's already got a pretty good resume. He's rich. Wouldn't we all like that on our resume? He's young. Wouldn't we all like that? And he's got authority. He's a ruler. You know how possibly could we make this better? He's got the endorsement of a famous rabbi. He's righteous. He's holy. And he's looking for that endorsement, saying, I've already kept all of these laws. But Jesus says, no, sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. If you think about that, you know how many people ever got the personal invitation from the mouth of Jesus? You come follow me. I can think of 12. And I can think of, there's this one other guy that said, first let me go bury my father. And Jesus said to him, no, you come follow me. And then this other guy here, the rich young ruler. That, as far as I know, I can think of 14 people who got the invitation from the mouth of Jesus to say, you, come follow me. You're invited. You have a spot on the team. And he walked away sad. He walked away sad because he loved God's blessings more than he loved the God who gave them. And I think we know that because of what we call him. I can't help but notice that there's a lot of people in the Bible, and we find out their names, but we never find out this guy's name. But we know everything about him that he wanted us to know. He's a rich, young ruler. And we don't know his name because he didn't follow Jesus. Because he loved the blessing more than he loved the giver of the blessing. Are we willing to follow God if there is nothing in it for us? One of the verses that describes the Christian life is in Romans chapter 12, verse 1. That's where Paul says, therefore, offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your reasonable act of worship. Did you catch that phrase? There's a paradox there. It says living sacrifice. There's a problem with a living sacrifice because a living sacrifice has this way of crawling off the altar. There's a reason that you usually kill it before you throw it up on the barbecue. Because the altar is an uncomfortable place to be as a living sacrifice. And often it's right where God wants us to be, to live a life on the altar. But being a living sacrifice means that we die to ourselves every day. And that a lot of Christians who say that if the opportunity faced them, that they would be willing to die for Jesus. And maybe some of us would if we were in such a tight, cornered kind of situation. But do we have the guts to face the kind of situation where we have to die to ourselves every day and say, not my will, but yours today? And when we can look deep into our soul and see that we are willing to give everything over and sacrifice it all on the altar, to just know that we have pleased God, and even if we don't get the blessings back in return, then God can look at us like he does to Abraham and say, I know that you fear God. Verse 3. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. And when he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place that God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and he saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, you stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there, and we will worship, and then we'll come back to you. So Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed his son Isaac on it. And he himself carried the fire for the knife. And as the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the 2 of them went on together. And when they reached the place that God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it, and he bound his son Isaac. And the story shifts into super slow-mo. He bound his son Isaac. He laid him on top of the wood. And he reached out his hand, and he took the knife to slay his son. We need to pause to soak this moment in fully. Do you see the sweat on Abraham's brow? Do you see the tremble in his hand? Do you see the tears streaming down Abraham's cheeks in this moment in verse 10? And I don't know exactly how it went down, but in my own mind's eye, I see Abraham's arm and hand raised with the knife, and I see it tremble. And in the moment that the hand begins to come down in resolution, That's when we get to verse 11. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham, here I am. He replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. And your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all the nations of the earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. God keeps his promise. But there's a second answer to that question that we were asking. What kind of God would ask this kind of sacrifice from someone? The first answer to the question was the kind of God that wants to know what we love more, God or the blessings that he gives us. But the second answer to the question, I think, is that it's the kind of God who is willing to sacrifice his own son. See, that's why I think that this just might be God's favorite Old Testament story. Because there was another story about a son, 2,000 years later. Another son, an only son. A son whom the father loved. A son that was taken to the top of a mountain. Again, a son that carried the wood. And again, a son that questioned his father. My God, why have you forsaken me? And again, the son was laid on the wood to be sacrificed. But on that day, there was no voice to stop the blade in midair. In that day, there was no ram to substitute as a sacrifice. On that day, the son was pierced. And on that day, the father wept and mourned the death of his son. On that day, God's heart was pierced again. But that day, rather than a ram instead of the son, it was a son instead of you. Because when you encounter the God who asks you to sacrifice, remember that you are encountering the God who is willing to sacrifice more. The God who is willing to make the ultimate sacrifice, the kind of God who is willing to sacrifice his own son to be reconciled back to you. And when God asks us to get on the altar of sacrifice, he's not asking us to do anything he hasn't already done himself. So when the game was over, the answer became a lot more clear. The visiting team from Gainesville, all 14 players, were all placed in handcuffs. And they got back on the bus, and on the side the bus read, Gainesville State Juvenile Correctional Center. But the reason that they had people cheering for them for the very first time is because of the Grapevine coach. His name was Chris Hogan. He wanted his school to send the opposing team a message, and this is what he said. He said he wanted to let that opposing team know that you are just as valuable as any other person on earth. And as they prepared for this in the weeks leading up to the game, there were fans and there were boosters and there were parents that objected. And they said, why should we cheer against our own kids for a bunch of convicted drug-dealing kids that are convicted of things like robbery and assault? And Coach Hogan said, imagine if you didn't have any home life. Imagine if everyone had pretty much just given up on you. And then imagine what it would mean for hundreds of people suddenly to believe in you. And when the clock ran down to zeros, both teams knelt together at the 50-yard line for prayer. And the quarterback of the Tornadoes, Isaiah was his name, the quarterback prayed this: Lord, I don't know how this happened, so I don't know how to say thank you. But I never would have known that there were so many people in the world that cared about us. Hebrews puts it this way: it was by faith that Abraham offered Isaac as a sacrifice when God was testing him. Abraham, who had received God's promises, was ready to sacrifice his only son, Isaac, even though God had told him, Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted. And Abraham reasoned that if Isaac died, that God was able to bring him back to life again. And in a sense, Abraham did receive his son back from the dead. See, Abraham becomes the father of faith because Abraham believed in the power of the resurrection 2,000 years before resurrection power ever was known on this earth. And the grapevine parents could cheer for a bunch of criminals to hit their own kids because they knew in the power of the resurrection. And you can live each day on the altar as a living sacrifice because you know the power of the resurrection, because there is nothing that you can sacrifice for God that He can't raise back to life.